Hi, welcome. My name is Egbert Schram. I'm the Group CEO at Hofstede Insights. And for the last few years, we've been working on the Cubin platform together with a variety of partners. And I'll share a little bit more about this later down the presentation. So let's talk about first the environment that we're using. At the moment, everybody is muted, but that does not, however, mean that you can't be sharing opinions and observations. If you wish to share any messages in the chat screen that we can then later on during the Q&A follow up on, you'll find that chat button in the lower right screen of your corner. You just click chat and you select the recipient, and with that, the message basically goes there where it should be going. I'll be your host for today, walking you through the link between culture and innovation, and Hannah will be supporting you on the background. Who am I? As said, my name is Egbert Schram. That's a very Dutch pronunciation. The international version is Egbert. And in daily life, my job includes being the Group CEO at Hofstede Insights. And for the last, give or take, almost 2 decades, what I've been working on is topics related to helping, among others, SMEs to internationalize, and also larger organizations, for example, to become more innovative, as there are some differences between how small and mid-sized companies go about innovation and how larger organizations go about this. Besides a little bit of an introduction to myself, let's talk a little bit more about the topic of culture, because you'll hear this buzzword everywhere. People have changes in business strategies, but are insecure if things are going to work. They will start partnering with other organizations and wonder, do our working practices fit? If they communicate across borders, do messages land? And also, if we talk about innovation, the need to be innovative. Culture basically impacts quite a few things. Now, when we talk about culture, Hofstede Insights, our organization, is a bit of a thought leader, and this is me being Scandinavian. What we've been doing over the last 30 plus years is basically using data analytics to model human behavior. And that's quite useful because you can make some good and useful predictions in how groups of people are likely to behave in certain contexts. Why do we do this? Because if you talk about modifying group behavior, and with that mindsets, and innovation is one of these mindsets, it is useful to understand what can I expect so that you don't get blindsided by it. And we do this basically with an organizational structure that spreads across about 60 countries and about 150 different associate partners. In a nutshell, 4 distinct areas where we operate: organizational mindsets, personal mindsets, how do brands and marketing function across cultures, and then we do tailored behavioral research. Range of organizations we work with, so also what this presentation is based on, it comes from a huge database, a huge amount of experience that we've collected over the last 3 decades, more than 5,000 organizations. So there are a few things that we can share there, and that we will be sharing. Now, obviously, we came here together today thanks to Cubin. About 5 years ago, we got contracted by EASME, the European Commission, to build a learning platform to help European SMEs to basically do better when they internationalize and when they want to innovate across borders, but also within their own borders. Now, what does Cubin do? Besides offering insightful webinars like the one that you're attending today, it also gives you a range of self-assessment tools, and it gives you a whole library based on documentation, filled with documentation from a variety of emerging economies, all of which has one goal, and that is to help you be better prepared when you start going across borders. Now, if we talk about innovation, this wonderful picture that you see in front of you right now has boxes, but this little kid has made innovative use of those boxes. She basically made a rocket and made herself an astronaut. Often when we talk about innovation, the question is, what kind of innovation are we really talking about? Are we talking about in-the-box innovation, so things can be done more efficiently? Or are we talking about disruptive innovation, so that you really need to think out of that metaphorical box? The picture you see in front of you is a fairly recent event when India sent a mission to the moon. And you might not know this, but the budget that the Indian Space Agency used was only 10 million euros. Now compare this to the huge multiple hundreds of millions, if not billions of budget that NASA and the European Space Agency needed to get people on similar missions. In other words, not everything needs to necessarily be that disruptive. Also, process efficiency can actually in itself be disruptive because you can simply do things with a lot less money. Let's talk a bit about SMEs, because do they really matter in the economical landscape? Well, obviously, we wouldn't be today if the case were that weren't to be the case. This is how the EU defines SMEs, and just to give you a little bit of a shocker, this is the impact the SMEs are creating for the European labor market. Huge amount of employment, huge amount of taxes being paid. In other words, the backbone of the European Union is SMEs. And that's why for the EU, it's also been so important to invest in SMEs and their success when growing internationally. To put it in perspective, in Europe, there's about 10 million SMEs. In the emerging economies, there's about triple that. And that means there is lots of space for collaboration and learning from each other. But again, that does require certain mindset things to be set in place. So what is the key to innovation within SMEs? Two things. According to EU research, based on all the funding provided, as said before, European SMEs struggle with two things. One is capital, and as a consultancy, unfortunately, we cannot help with that. But what we can help with is that second item that SMEs struggle with, and that's also, again, why we're here today. It is the question of cultural preparedness. Are organizations themselves, as entities, and the people within the organizations ready to really go across borders and learn from abroad, but also bring teachings abroad? Now, I've been using the word culture a couple of times, but what does that really mean? Because there's many different definitions. Have a look at what you see in front of you. And in the chat screen, type what you see. So I have the chat screen open in front of me, so I should be able to get some answers there. I'm going to take a sip of water and then I'll see what comes in. Now, obviously, I'm playing a mind trick here, and some of you already had that in mind when answering me. Obviously, when you look straight at the picture, what you see is a frog. Now, some of you already saw also a horse. If you cannot see the horse, I would like you to do the following thing. Basically, switch your head this way. Now you can see the horse. Culture is about different perspectives. And that's very important to understand, obviously, when you go to new markets or when even you hire people from different markets. And obviously, this has a clear connotation to innovation, because innovation is actually, and I'll repeat this later on, it's about taking a different perspective on the same problem. Now, if we use a definition of culture, the way we define culture is basically based on one of our founders' supporting statements, which is the collective programming of the mind, with which one group distinguishes itself from another group. There are no rights and wrongs here, because could you say that you're wrong if you see a horse? No. Were you wrong when you saw the frog? No. There are simply different perspectives. And it is very useful to basically keep that in mind going forward. Another way of saying what culture is the way we do things around here. Well, I've got news for you. You can change anybody and everybody in your own organization, and newcomers will simply continue the same old way of working. And that's because within organizations, we have built certain mechanisms, certain practices that kind of indoctrinate people on how they should behave in order to fit in So if you relate this to culture and the culture of innovation, what does this mean? It means that you need to be mindful of those practices that support an innovative approach and those practices that basically kill it off. In other words, if you ask people for opinions and then you start shooting down the opinions, you're not being very constructive. So this is also a good thing for managers and leaders to keep in mind. Innovation is about creating a psychologically safe space where people can keep their minds open to look at things from different angles. In other words, it's about looking and going the other way. Now, research done in the past as well, also again by the EU and also by former partners in the Cuban project, indicated that if you talk about reverse innovation, what it means for markets in mature markets, such as Europe, there are a couple of lessons to be learned. And that is that obviously you can learn from emerging economies on how do you match the needs of people that have less purchasing power. And then those lessons you can bring back in terms of cheaper distribution channels, more efficient ways of production. And that allows you to also open up a much bigger market in Europe itself. So lessons learned abroad don't always just need to be applied abroad. They can also be taken home. If we talk about understanding which costs can we reduce in order to provide cheaper products that can increase the overall demand of our products, just go abroad. Talk about medical equipment. Normally it might take up to €1 million to develop an MRI scan. Go to emerging economies, they can do it for €100,000. Are they smarter? Perhaps. Do they look at the same problem from a different angle? Probably more likely the case. People live in certain contexts, and those context situations help them to reflect on the problem they see ahead of them in different ways. And this is also what an innovative mindset is about inside your own organization. Are you able to accommodate those different perspectives? In different markets, you might have never come across things that you would have come across in Europe. Again, new market segments, new product or service features that you would never have thought about because the reality in your home market is simply very different. So it's another good reason to go international. Good enough. Why would you invest a lot of money and time in making products that only last a year or two if good enough is good enough? And emerging economies are key examples of the good enough approach. Sometimes you might need to give in a little bit on the design to reduce costs, reduce therefore the barrier to purchase. Again, these are all mindset challenges that businesses need to struggle with and need to take decisions on. And again, new technologies. If we look at mobile banking, who knew that Africa leapfrogged Europe by basically going into mobile banking? And again, the context was so different. Banks had issues in being trusted. There was not really fintech, and then mobile phone producers. In this case, it was specifically Nokia. I do have to, of course, promote my home country of Finland a little bit. That made mobile banking a possibility, among others, with M-Pesa. Where does this all lead us? What are the things that you need to keep in mind from this presentation, also for your own organizations? A couple of things. First, understand how culture impacts your own mindset. It impact the mindset of the people that you work with inside your own organization. And again, this can all be measured. There are very good assessment tools, and Cuban has a few of these available that allow you to objectively reflect, are we really mentally ready to do things in a different way? Another thing is, are we mentally ready to do things in the way that our new market demands? Because if you go to another country and they have a very different way of working, and your own organization and you yourself is not willing to compromise on the ways of working, you might want to ask yourself the question, what am I going to do there in the first place? And that's the last part. Visualize for yourself, what are things that I can change in my own style of communication? and in the way of working within my own organization to better leverage insights from other markets, and with that reverse engineer the way, for example, we innovate. All it takes, and again, it's easier said than done, is an open mind and flexibility in critically reflecting consistently and continuously are the ways in which we work supporting that what we need to get done. And that basically leads us to a discussion about organizational readiness. Now, the way we look at organizational culture as such is the way in which members of an organization or a team relate to each other, the way they do their work, and the outside world in comparison to other organizations. If you want to be a learning organization, which is a critical feature of any innovative organization, it means that you, when interacting with your colleagues, your superiors, your subordinates, need to keep an open mind. To give one example, you need to be clear on what are the goals of the organization, because innovation without a goal, most SMEs don't have the budget for this. So there needs to be a clear goal consistency there. We need to understand how do we differentiate from competing organizations. All of this, again, can be mapped. And you want to do this in a very subtle but objective data-driven way, because otherwise you'll be talking about the way you think you are. We call that perceived culture. Or you might be talking about the way you like it to be. You like to be a learning organization. Congratulations. So does 99% of the whole world wants it to be. Question is, what kind of culture do you really have? And more importantly, what's the culture that you need to have in order to, for example, execute innovation targets? Now, that again leads us to that observation that, like with national cultural differences, organizational cultural differences are not about good and bad. They are very simply a reflection on is the way in which you relate to each other, the work in other organizations. Does it support your strategy? If yes, wonderful. If not, there are ways to work on that. And that's because culture inside a team, inside an organization, only has one goal. It's not a nice to have, it is simply the most effective way of executing strategic goals. Now, as I said before, there are different ways of engaging with this. And as I mentioned, what we do is we do behavioral analysis. And we've got data available on more than 100 countries, including a lot of emerging economies, but also mature markets, on how do people relate to simple equations such as, for example, power distance, and a difficult word for hierarchy. The lower the power distance, in other words, the less hierarchical needs there are, the more innovation thrives. Can you change the culture of your country? No, typically not. Can you select people that have value preferences that are more in line with behavioral tendencies that support innovation? Yes, you can, because you can measure for every single individual what are his or her cultural value preferences. If they have a preference for less hierarchy, it will typically help them to be a little bit more acceptant of doing things in different ways. Another example, very relevant for innovation, is a dimension we call uncertainty avoidance. Do we need to have at hand, or do we basically just come up with answers on the go? Again, we can filter on having employees that have certain preferences because apologies, there's somebody unmuted themselves. In the long run, you want to have employees that work in a way that makes strategic sense. In other words, for example, support innovation, but also like doing this. So you have this emotional sustainability. If we connect this to organizations, organizations have different challenges than countries. I think we can all agree on this. So we have a different model to look at mindsets within organizations. I'm giving you a very concrete example because we're going to do a case study in a moment. That case study talks about this first dimension, organizational effectiveness. On the left-hand side, what basically goes throughout the organization is that there's a lot of focus on how things get done, not on what gets done, because that is basically all the way on the right side. The question here is, we know that in order to be innovative, you need to be as goal-oriented as possible. But this is something you need to optimize, because if you work with extremely calibrated machinery, can you really be, and do you really need to be as goal-oriented as that marketeer who can basically freely, without many regulations, do his or her work? So our work reality is important to keep into account. And that basically gives us the following case study. Now, what I would like you to do, I'll move back one screen. I want you to take a screenshot of this screen. I'll give you 10 seconds. Screenshot taken. This is the case. We have a company. It works in the medical product sector, and it is extremely efficient. It's also heavily impacted by regulations, obviously. Products cannot have any errors. If there are errors, people die. At the same time, the reality in the business world is that this business faces problems with the speed of innovation, especially from smaller startups in the medical sector. They are less heavily regulated, so they can basically move a little bit faster. Now, the new strategy calls for agile and lean thinking. What I would like you to do, and we're just going to do this really shortly, just as a brain opener, what should be the optimal culture that this large organization needs to have? And what I would like you to do in the chat screen, give me two answers. One is a score for the management team, on a scale of 0 to 100, how high should that management team score? And one is for the R&D team. So basically, I want you to give me numbers. Group A, what should be their number, and Group B, what should be their number. And then let's have a quick look at what you can all come up with. And you'll have 2 minutes to do this quite quickly, basically with a gut instinct. I will mute myself for a moment. I've gotten, in the meanwhile, some 15 different answers, so that's quite a few. And the general tendency tends to be, with a very quick calculation, that people indicate that the management team should score around 50 or 60, and the R&D team should score higher at around 70 or 90. Now, let's go back to the previous slide.
Will be changed.
Basically, what we can see here is that if a management team, I think we can take the answers to questions. We could wait for maybe 15 minutes and we can go into Q&A. So basically what happens if a management team scores more oriented on how things get done than an R&D team, what you will end up with is micromanagement. So the core challenge in most organizations is to be very deliberate on what is the function that people have and how does that function correspond to how they should be working. Obviously, if a management team operating on the top, it should have a helicopter view. A management team should not be doing things. It should enable other functions to do things. And that's why what you often see in the case of innovation is that R&D teams are limited by management teams because management teams are too hands-on. And especially in SMEs, this is the challenge because often the founder thinks that he or she knows better than the people that he or she has hired. And this is an organizational cultural issue. So moving forward, basically what you have here is also a reflection on what type of innovation do you need. When we engage in consulting projects, basically what you can see is that innovation is not just one dimension. There are multiple dimensions that are involved. But in a nutshell, what you can see in the quadrant in front of you is that if you want to have out-of-the-box innovation, you need to be as goal-oriented and as easygoing as possible. And the as possible part is important because this will be different for every single organization. If you want to have in-the-box innovation, so efficiency, it is, again, a matter of being as goal-oriented as possible, but being very meticulous. In other words, when we talk about innovation inside our own organizations, we need to be very, very clear on what is the type of innovation that we need. Moving forward, to summarize as well, to innovate is basically to understand the context in which you operate and leverage it. And there are a couple of laws or guidelines to keep in mind. Knowledge multiplies when it's shared. In other words, you need to have a very open communication stream inside your organization. Anybody that treats knowledge as power, by definition, minimizes the chances for innovation because innovation thrives where there is openness. Second, innovation is not just about good ideas, it's also about execution and implementation. And that requires, again, as mentioned a moment ago, a great sense of goal orientation, clarity on what it is that you're innovating for. The third part is related to collaboration. And that's also a matter of easygoingness because different people think horse and frog. Different people will have different ways of looking at things. And you need to be easygoing, relaxed enough, open enough to understand why are people thinking differently, why are they behaving differently, and how can we leverage these differences? And that is where culture comes in. It helps you to visualize where differences originate from, and with that have a meaningful discussion on what might be the better way to support this specific strategy that we have. Now, what does this mean for larger organizations? And after that, I'll wrap it up. First, understand how your own way of working is impacting innovation capability, because over the last few years of analyzing organizational cultures, we've analyzed about 200 organizations per year. What we can see is a paradox. Organizations are becoming more and more goal-oriented, but at the same time, they're also becoming much more strict. And research has shown over and over again that that is an okay thing if you talk about innovation in the box, efficiency. But for out of the box, disruptive innovation, it's not very useful to be very precise and very meticulous because, again, out of the box requires, again, a certain amount of open-mindedness. When you partner with SMEs, understand their ways of working and how that fits with your own ways of working, because there's plenty of large organizations that talk about a startup mentality. Not so smart because 90% of startups go bankrupt in the first year. Why do you want to have a startup mentality? What is the type of mentality in the SME that you're planning to collaborate with? And again, if you leave this up to assumption, you're setting things up for failure because it can all be measured. If you work together, if you partner, agree on what are the joint working practices. The most simple and efficient cross-cultural collaboration tip I'll give you is when you start partnering with partners from across the border, have a joint kickoff meeting, if possible in person, if not possible in today's circumstances, then virtually, and have a session on how do we relate to the horse and frog equation. If we talk about things like goal orientations, how do we agree on goals? Do we dictate? Do we vote? Etc. If you leave this up for chances, then after 3 to 6 months, you'll realize, that's what you meant. Well, congratulations, you just wasted 6 months. So it's good to take the time up front to carefully sit down and discuss and agree on what are the ways we will work together. And obviously, larger companies typically have a bit more capital at hand, so that will solve question number 2 or challenge number 2 for SMEs, which is the lack of capital. that was basically what I had to share with you with regards to culture and innovation and how these two correlate. What I will do now is that I'll stop sharing my screen and we will basically go into the Q&A session. And Anna, I trust that you will be facilitating that session and I will try to answer as many questions as possible.
Yeah, first, thank you so much. I think it was very, very interesting. Let's see. So a couple of you unmute yourself during the session, so maybe you may have some questions or comments. I think most of the content, as far as I know from talking to you, the network all the time, I think there was a lot of overlap with kind of what you are facing day to day in your work with SMEs. So I think this this very much resonates with what you are facing on a daily basis. If you have any questions, feel free to unmute yourself or leave a comment.
We have one question here, which is, can managers be innovators, R&D suggesters as well? Yeah, why not? The question there is, and this is again a cultural question, are the managers the ones that then also execute, need to have all the answers, or are they the ones that initiate? So it's really a question of what are the cultures that are involved. In some cultures, it's perfectly acceptable for managers to be doers. In other cultures, managers should manage. So it's really a question of what are the type of national cultures involved? What are the type of organizational cultures involved? So as such, the answer to the question, can managers also be innovators and R&D suggesters? Yes, it can be. In that sense, the answer is, I guess, a bit vague. It basically means it's all contextual. It really depends on what is the context in which you're operating. What are the cultures that are involved? What are the organizations or the teams involved?
Yeah, I would agree. I mean, in the case study, you did say that with managers, oftentimes the majority of their job is to kind of lead, to trigger ideas, to get everything going, less so really getting into the doing of things. And you mentioned that sometimes managers can be well forthcoming that way, that they would do the tasks themselves rather than actually giving it over to their employees because they think they can do it better themselves. And I think this is a very crucial difference. It's not so much should a manager be an innovator as well or shouldn't he, but more so where is he coming from. They can be innovators, but if they say they want to be in the doing, then the motivation for being in the doing and being in the action shouldn't be so much as to say, I want to do this because I don't trust my staff, but more so I want to do this together with my team. I think there is a difference, which of course, again, is very much dependent on the company, the setting, the structures within the company, etc.
Yeah, no, I think that's a good observation there. I think we have some more questions there. Chat is opening up. That's always good.
When speaking about emerging markets, which definition of emerging markets do you use?
So the definition that we use is the definition that we got asked to follow by the European Commission. So I unfortunately don't have a technical answer for you. I can see that Eric, our partner in Cuban, is in the call. So maybe Eric, if you want to give the definition of emerging economies from EASMA's point of view. So we'll send a private message to Eric to see if he can come back on that question later on in more technical detail.
Yeah, well, Lorna, if we will share the recording. Thank you that you mentioned. I was going to mention it at the end. Fine for everyone. I would share the recording with you later on. If you don't feel comfortable, And we would have to check if we can blur out some of the names or anything. But if fine for you, we would like to share recording, yes.
Okay, then we have some more.
Yes. Do you also develop action/implementation plans with SMEs based on your analyses?
Yes, we do. And again, typical actions, some things are a bit more complicated than others. I mean, if you have certain working practices that are really miles away from a type of optimal culture that would support, for example, innovation, then it might take a little bit more time. Some things are quite simple. If we talk about cross-cultural communication exercises and training, it's a fairly standard operation that we do for SMEs. We use certain methodologies that people are not dependent on country-specific expertise, but just get a global methodology in their head. We call it, it's our Hofstede 6D model, basically, 6 dimensions of national culture. And we use that methodology to basically give people a good understanding of how do different countries deal with basic questions like power, like uncertainty avoidance, and what then does that mean when you interact with these people. So those are programs that are quite well running and also in SMEs.
What is the process for an SME wanting to enter a new market?
I would say the process is probably similar to the process that we would advise for larger organizations. So we have a fairly unique database as well on, for example, consumer behavior. So we can slice and dice for more than 60 countries on what is the target group that you're aiming at, what are the value preferences that that target group has from a cultural perspective. Connect that to your own marketing ability. Do you, for give you a concrete example, in many cultures there is a very emotional concept called privilege. If you have a certain power position, you get privileges. If you, like me, have grown up in a country, the Netherlands, and are living in a country like Finland, where power is not really an issue, we're all the same, right? Whether you're a group CEO or the president, who cares? You're all the same. So privilege is not something that we emotionally can very easily connect to. And that means that also when you do your marketing across borders and you're planning to enter a market which is culturally very different from your own, is that it pays off to do a cultural analysis on your target groups in that market. Because even if the economical figures indicate that it might be wise to invest, if the cultural gap is too big, my advice, don't go for it. Even large organizations that have multiple billions worth of budget, like a Tesco in the US, and we're talking about 2 countries speaking the same language, they failed simply because they were not able to culturally adapt to the needs of their new market. Long story short, if you're an SME, you're planning to go to another country, do a proper cultural due diligence to see where are the biggest gaps and see if they're that big that they might not be surmountable in the short run. So you might want to choose a different market. If they're not that big, minor tweaks might do in terms of how you position your product or service, in terms of who sells it for you. So long story short, do a cultural due diligence. That's obviously something that we can assist with.
And then Matilda was kind to post a link from the Commission's website on definition of emerging markets. So please check that out. I did look into it, but it's quite a lot, so I will spare you reading it to you.
I think we had an interesting question here. There was a private question. When a 25-year-old firm that is into manufacturing undergoes restructuring and turnaround, how do they innovate in version 2.0? Let me put it this way, that if in that restructuring you do not address the organizational culture of the organization, you can change all your processes, you can change all your structures, but nothing will change. In other words, number one reason for failure of most change projects is that there are plenty of really good consultancies that can help you change your processes and change your structures and systems. There's just one little issue there. People are the ones using these processes and these systems. And if you don't change the mindset that people have when engaging with new processes and new systems, things will be back to basic, back to normal, the old days basically, within no time. So if you're going to do these kind of turnarounds, start by understanding what are the mindset issues, because you might not even need to change all the systems and the processes. Sometimes it's just a question of why do we use them the way we do? And again, this can be analyzed and this can be done in a consulting project to basically help with processes like that.
Damien asks or comments, I guess that the key to innovation in any form, in box or out of the box, is open-mindedness and flexible regulations in company, which allow this. The problem is that some national cultures are less stimulating to innovation. Yeah, which I guess is true.
It's basically a reflection on, typically we know from research as well, is that innovation, especially disruptive innovation, is helped by less focus on hierarchy and is helped by an attitude of learning on the go. But if you want to have innovation in of the box, so more efficiency, those same things that help with being out of the box innovative will work against you. Because for efficiency, you need a certain amount of strictness, you need a processes to be in place, and you need the managers that can make sure that people follow these processes. So it is basically a reflection on, again, what is the type of innovation that you need? If you need disruptive innovation in a hierarchical, highly uncertainty avoidant culture, you need to go about it in a different way. And it's also a question, do you even want to do that in such a culture? So again, there, also to answer another question that came up, the way we engage with these kind of processes is that we basically do a needs assessment of what actually is it that you need as a client. What are the target groups that you're targeting in a certain market? And are these target groups large enough to warrant investment of making sure that you can do the type of innovation that you need to get done? Because take India, take China, both are very hierarchical cultures. Does that mean that you can't do disruptive innovation? No, not really, because there might be more people in India and China that have less preference for hierarchy than there are, for example, Finnish or Dutch people, simply because these countries are obviously rather big. So it always starts with a proper needs assessment, understanding what is it actually that you want to innovate about, who is it that you want to innovate towards to, with that regards, then basically look into what are ways that you can do in order to create the type of innovation that you need. If you are thinking of establishing R&D centers, again, some cultures are more stimulating towards, again, disruptive R&D, so more the research component. Other cultures are more conducive towards helping development to take place. So all of these are basically cultural analysis questions. And because the world is rather large, it depends on the countries that we're talking about to really give a lot more precise advice.
Yep. Another question is, aren't national cultures less stimulating to innovation, but the national strategies?
I'll give you a very concrete example of Finland. And that's not just because I live there, but also because in Europe, most of the venture capital goes to startups located in Finland, simply because of the funding mechanisms put in place by the Finnish government. There's a lot of money that goes into startups for innovation, but the success rate is not really that good. And the reason there is that the Finnish mindset, to just give one example, is very much geared towards the efficiency part. It is about product excellence. It's about product innovation. What the challenge in Finland is and this is a foreigner perspective on this particular policy, with which I'm a bit more familiar, is that they don't think far enough ahead. All they think about is product innovation. But hey, products don't sell themselves. So countries can invest a lot in innovation. But as said, innovation itself also doesn't sell itself. So these questions should also be reflected on the national policy. Does it stimulate SMEs or big companies alike to keep the culture equation in mind when they get funding for innovation? Because innovation in itself is never a goal. You also need to make money. This is the simple business equation. So it's basically a question of, again, what's the type of innovation that is supported? How is it supported? And towards which markets is it supported? Because going back to the personal examples, Finnish companies overwhelmingly fail in the big market, which is in this case the US. They do quite a lot better in certain cultures that have much more in common with the Finnish national culture. And this has also been one call of attention for a lot of European SMEs. Understand the culture fit between your own organization, the people in that organization, the products that you have, and the markets that you go to. Because sometimes it is as simple as changing the structure of your sales pitch to sell a product. Sometimes you need to go a little bit further.
Yeah, we have two more questions. One is very relevant, I think, to all of you. Do you see with COVID-19 any opportunity for SMEs and organizations to consider innovation in a different way?
I would say that, and this is a guesstimate, as we don't have research data available on this, is that what the whole COVID situation does is that it puts everybody in a very different mental mode. You can see your colleagues in their homes, assuming they use video, with their kids and cats and dogs and whatnot, working through the screen. And personally, what I like about it is that it basically helps everybody to chill down a bit. And of course, this is a very Dutch answer. Life is about more than work. And if that mindset prevails, that life is about more than just work, which again is culturally biased, you might get circumstances whereby people do indeed chill down a bit. They do give each other a bit more space, because in the end, to work successfully with each other, whether it is within a country or across cultures, it starts with having the time to understand where do other people come from. That time also creates mental space, which you need for innovation. So long story short, if the behaviors lead to more easygoing kind of ways of working, you can expect much more out-of-the-box innovation going forward in the future. If it does not, we might simply get more efficient processes, which is also innovation, but a different type.
Yeah, I see a lot of agreement here that life is more about more than just work. Damien has a question which refers back to the point before. How do we explain the situation when the most hierarchical cultures of the East countries are among the most innovative at the same time?
So let me understand the question correctly. Damien, with this, do you mean that within the Eastern countries, those countries in the East which are the most hierarchical are the most innovative, or do you mean that Eastern countries are more innovative than Western countries? So the first option basically was that in the Eastern countries, the countries that are more hierarchical are more innovative, or appear to be more innovative than those that are not. I guess I don't have data at hand here, but if you want to have a guesstimate here, if you look at the East, and specifically if we talk about Japan, Japan is an Eastern country, and unlike a lot of people think, Japan is actually not at all that hierarchical. It's actually average. And what Japan focuses a lot on is process efficiency. And that's why you can actually see, if we talk about, for example, robotics, where Japan is clearly a front runner. Japan is a country that is also extremely old. Most of the world's companies that are older than 100 years are Japanese. They're either Japanese or German. And that has a reason, and that's because people look further ahead. So it's much more about hierarchy from an expertise point of view than hierarchy from a social point of view. So I would probably say, based on my own knowledge, that I'm not sure if I can agree with the statement. What I could use as an explanation is that we need to distinguish that sometimes hierarchy comes from expertise. In other words, the hair doctor professor, if we use the German example, or we use the Japanese example of the television salesman who built Panasonic, the world's largest television company, I believe. Their expertise, their hierarchy, their hierarchical position, it comes from expertise, not from social status, which is, for example, the schools that you went to, which are much more important in countries like France or, for example, Russia, or a lot of the African countries, where the connections matter more than the actual factual expertise. So that's how I would explain that situation, that it might be a matter of perception, that the countries in the East which are more innovative, in my estimation, tend to be rather more scoring high on a dimension we call uncertainty avoidance, which relates to expertise, and not so much to the social hierarchical point of view.
And I mean, coming back to the question, I think it's like generally, I think it's a bit tricky or even misleading to have this view of hierarchy equals less innovation or anything. So I would generally stray away from too harsh of like equaling hierarchy equals no innovation or less innovation.
I totally agree with that. Of course, it's a matter of what kind of landscape is more conductive towards innovation. Because at the same time, the beautiful thing about countries that are very hierarchical, but also, for example, score very low on uncertainty avoidance, is that they can pivot extremely fast, way faster than a lot of Western organizations can. So again, it is all contextual, and we need to understand what is the type of innovation that we talk about, and what's the type of innovation that we need or the markets that we service need.
Yeah, absolutely. I have a different question, if I may just jump in. If any of you have other questions or comments, please feel free to type them in or unmute yourself. I found it very interesting when you talked about behavioral analyses, because we haven't had any contact with that area, and I think that is a very complex area to begin with. Do you see in your analysis with companies, do you see kind of trends that are more so applicable for SMEs or more so applicable for bigger companies? Is there any difference in how the behavioral analyses turn out, or is it just a cross-border, very individual?
Cross-border, the main observation that we can make, and the same goes for SMEs and for larger organizations alike, is that at the same time as they're becoming more goal-oriented, which helps with innovation, because there's less focus on how you do your job, more focus on what it is that you're doing. So that's good. At the same time, we see also a competing trend, which is that organizations are becoming much more strict. And of course, that helps if the innovation has to be about efficiency. It doesn't help if it has to be about disruption. Because think about it this way. If you need to do something that has never been done before, you cannot be meticulous about it because you have no idea what you're doing. There are no guidelines, there are no standards, there are no benchmarks. So it doesn't help to be very strict and precise. The greatest innovations, they came by accidents. Things happened. People were tinkering around and voila, all of a sudden new medicine or new technology. So these are basically the main trends that we can spot in the analyses that we have done, which is these two competing trends. More goal orientation, at the same time, there is also much more strictness. And that strictness can be explained simply by the fact that more and more businesses, SMEs and large organizations alike, are confronted with new stuff all the time. And despite popular belief that the internet is making us all the same, actually what the internet does is that it reinforces the fact that we're different. We just use the same phone or we use the same media platform, but our intentions in the usage, they are as old as the Stone Age. So cultures don't converge, they diverge. And that basically means that as organizations, SME, big companies alike, we need to be mindful of the fact that people are different and that is a good thing, because in that difference, we can both find similarity and opportunity. And I think, and that's been the really nice thing about the Cubin platform as well, obviously, is that it makes a lot of this knowledge available for SMEs as well. Because, for example, in our consultancy, we typically engage with larger companies or SMEs that are, let's say, 50 people or bigger. But a lot of that services is now made available also to SMEs via Cubin if people have only 20 or 30 or 40 people. So that's basically been the beauty of Cubin. It made a lot of these insights available to companies that are at this dilemma on how to engage with the question of innovation.
Yeah, I think that's very crucial as well, because feedback we receive from the network, or we have been receiving over the last years, is oftentimes SMEs in particular are struggling with innovation because they don't really know what it is. They feel like it's something they should jump on because it's a buzzword, everything is doing innovations. So they feel like they should be doing it, but they don't know what it is. And I think same goes for culture, the concept of culture, and especially organizational culture. I think a lot of times with SMEs especially, they don't take organizational culture seriously because they don't know exactly what it is. They don't know exactly how it should be or how it can be or how their own organizational culture is at the moment. But then also B, they don't really know what the impact can be for different organizational cultures or for changes in the culture. I think that is a crucial point that a lot of companies simply don't know. And then also, of course, how can you change something that you don't know anything about?
Good observation. Yeah.
Yeah, I think for that, the platform is brilliant to help them just get on track, to educate them on what it actually is before they go into tackling different areas of it. Yeah. Okay. Any other questions or comments? Yes, a lot of SMEs are not even aware that they do have an organizational culture. Absolutely.
Yeah, I think like organizational culture happens whether you want it or not. It simply grows. The question is, does it support strategy? And of course, that's something that we tend to help organizations a lot with in making that link clear. Can see some questions with regards to the 6D model of national culture. So if you look at our website, hofstadeinsights.com, there is quite a lot of free information available, similar on Cubin. A lot of the articles are based on the 6D model, so there's a lot of literature that you can read for free. And if you want to make it more personal, of course, there we have different kinds of assessment tools available. Some free of charge on Cubin, some that are costed on the Hofstede Insights side. So it's basically a question of exploring that, and please do reach out in case you want to have more information on that. Then I think, Hannah, we probably have to take the last question before we call it a day. we used to consider US mindset and culture more focused on innovation than the EU one. How do you see innovation evolution in EU companies? Well, first of all, I think I would need to correct that statement, because if you look at the World Economic Forums and several other indicators, it's actually within the EU, specifically the Nordic countries, that lead pretty much all indicators with regards to innovation. So it is definitely not the US. The US simply does one thing really well, and that is marketing the stuff that it does. And that's what Europe sometimes has some challenges. It's perhaps slightly too modest with all the innovation that it does. So I would say that innovation is becoming more and more prevalent inside European companies. European companies, luckily, start seeing that Europe is not that bad a place to be. There's quite a lot of scope for growth already within the European marketplace. And I think that's also why the EU made that investment in Cuban, is to help people understand that Europe has one really strong feature, and that is it is the most diverse place on earth. There is not one European culture. That is something, of course, that in my opinion, the EU had to realize. But what makes Europe Europe is its cultural diversity. And that is basically personally what I love about Europe. And that's also something that you can find on our website when you start looking at mindset differences. If you look within Cuban and you start comparing mindset differences with emerging economies, Europe is simply an amazing test place, because you are tested with mindsets that you will also find in places that are not in Europe. So doing that testing inside Europe already helps you to basically minimize the risks a little bit. And that's an innovation evolution that I have personally observed, is that European companies do appear to do a little bit more of this. And of course, I think the European assistance programs have been really, really useful.
Yeah, absolutely. I think we will finish the session for today here. As I mentioned, we will make the recording available through different channels, so look out for that. If you have any other questions, I'll also include your email address that was in the presentation. If there's anything later on that comes to mind. Yeah, other than that, thank you so much for your presentation. I myself learned a lot. I'm going home with a lot of notes. So thank you.
Perfect.
All of you did as well. So, and thank you for all the interesting questions as well.
Likewise, also my behalf, Hannah, thank you for hosting and moderating. Thank you to all the participants for staying and hanging in for that long. In case you do want to reach out, as Hannah mentioned, she'll be sharing my contact details, and I'll also just type it in the chat screen. If you're a fast note taker, it is actually quite simple, and here it comes. There you go. In case you want to reach out, feel more than welcome. As it is sunny here and it is Friday afternoon, I might pull a Scandinavian thing, and that is I'm going to probably go for weekend. But if I get your emails, I'll surely respond next week. Thank you for hanging in. Have a nice weekend. Cheers and goodbye.